So moving along, we're going to be inviting the last panelist to share a little bit of their wisdom with us. So our next panelist is Brandon Yan. So Brandon is a community activist, a human rights educator, and an LGBTQ+ advocate. He is currently the Deputy Executive Director for Out on Screen, an organization that illuminates, celebrates, and advances queer lives through film, education, and dialogue through its two core programs, the Vancouver Queer Film Festival and Out in Schools. He has collaborated with the Ministry of Education, BC Teachers Federation, and other stakeholders to address the needs of LGBTQ+ youth through policies and practices that foster inclusive and more supportive school environments. Brandon understands that representation of diverse and complex intersecting identities is important, and it is this conviction and his experience that led him to run for Vancouver City Council in 2018 with One City. His campaign focused on amplifying the voices of renters, the arts community, young people, and other groups who are underrepresented in our local government. Though he didn't win, it brought forward important conversations on representation, sexuality, and race. He has a master's in urban studies from SFU, or Simon Fraser University, and served on the City of Vancouver's City Planning Commission from 2014 to 2016. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Brandon.
So thank you so much for having me, and thanks to Golsa and Sammie Joe. I'll just kind of get into it. Usually the way I like to have these conversations is something I learned from a couple of workshops I've been a part of. Starting with the question, what's the story of your name? For a lot of us, our names are given to us. Sometimes we are able to kind of make our own names. And it's a question I hadn't really thought of until a little while ago, when my name became quite a hot topic during the last civic election in Vancouver. So this is my Chinese name. So I mostly go by my English name, Brandon Yan. My Chinese name, the characters mean remember or remembrance, and that last character means origin or root. So the name that my father had given me in Chinese literally means remember where you come from. And so thinking about how, how my family has come to these territories is complicated, like lots of us, but it's always something I keep in the forefront of my mind now. When I was growing up, I grew up in Langley. For those of you who don't know the Metro Vancouver area, it's a suburb. It's predominantly a white suburb. I'm also mixed race, so half my family is also white. And so for the longest time, I thought of myself as mostly white. I didn't grow up learning any Cantonese. Coming to realize that in my mid-20s, it was kind of a realization of that I need to get to know more about who I am and where I come from, and to stop being ashamed actually about my racial heritage. Because I think that for a lot of us, we grow up, we watch media, we watch TV, and we don't necessarily see ourselves reflected in the landscape around us. And so here's a picture of my dad's family in 1951 in Hong Kong. And for me, and the issue of coronavirus and kind of the whole thing around COVID-19 and systems of oppression, in many ways, as the other speakers were talking about, these are not new issues, but what happens in times of crises and in particular times of emphasis is that they get blown up or they get magnified more than normal. And so thinking about the ways in which we interact with the world and the way the world interacts with us is thinking about how we walk about, our lives. And one way to look at that is through the concept of intersectionality, which is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, an African-American scholar, feminist, who coined this term to talk about feminism and critiquing feminism in the way in which feminism only looked at women's rights through kind of a white supremacist lens. Thinking about the ways in which sexuality, gender, class, ability, race, all kind of create this experience, right, for all of us. and the ways in which the world interacts with us. So thinking about all these things like racism, ableism, classism, sexism, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, biphobia, these things have always existed and they continue to exist. And in times of crisis, they are exacerbated. So we're looking at issues of racism right now, as Golsa was talking about, these instances of racism, which allude to a bigger systemic problem that we're all facing. Things like ableism. Who can access medical care if you can't leave your home, or you can't access public transit because service has been reduced? Or thinking about the ways in which in Canada and in Vancouver, the employment benefits for folks who've lost their jobs is actually greater financially than the amount that we give folks who are on disability. So in ways in which we have been doling out resources to the folks who are able-bodied, lost their job, compared to those folks who are disabled and receive a lower amount for being able to live. Like, how does that make any sense of equity or fairness or justice, right? In classism, sexism, misogyny, thinking about the frontline workers in healthcare professions who are mostly predominantly women and women of color, and how this crisis impacts them as well. And homophobia actually comes into play as well. There's been a couple articles about, for folks who don't know, gay men are still banned from donating blood. So I cannot donate blood, even though I have my blood tested fairly regularly. And this actually leads to a previous crisis, which was the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s. And it's a holdover from then. So even if I were to contract COVID-19 and recover, and there was a call for antibodies and research and plasma so that we could create vaccines, I would be unable to support that effort because I'm a gay man. And this highlights a couple things for me. There are two issues. One is that we've heard instances of racism, this first picture pointing fingers at one of our elders, and the ways in which COVID has kind of exacerbated some anti-Asian sentiment in Vancouver. I myself experienced this when I ran for election. Growing up kind of feeling not Asian and not Asian enough to suddenly being too Asian when I ran for office. And thinking about ways in which Vancouver, our system, even our government system, excludes folks. So for instance, right now is the first time in decades where we actually don't have anyone of Asian descent sitting on city council. And in the 100+ years that the city of Vancouver has been, was established on these unceded territories, only about a dozen Asian folks have ever been elected to that council chamber as well.
Brandon, you have 1 minute left.
Oh no, okay. And the second picture there is kind of alluding to the actual impact of who's being infected, how people are accessing healthcare, and what Sammie Jo was talking about is we don't actually collect the data on race in Canada. And last week in the UK, we actually saw some research out of there that showed that Black and Chinese and Asian folks actually have a much higher death rate from COVID-19 than white folks. And this isn't because of any racial inequity, but it's because of long systemic oppression around access to health, poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And one quick issue I will bring up as well is these, what we call lateral violence. So I've been also witnessing a lot of finger pointing within Asian communities to other Asian communities about who's to blame for COVID-19. I've seen some prominent Hong Kong activists continue to call it the Wuhan or China virus, which doesn't actually further, I think, the conversation that we're trying to have in either recovery as well. Getting quicker here. And then one last thing I'll leave you with is a bunch of different things that are happening. So in times of crisis, I always find it helpful to look at the folks who are leading some of the work that's much necessary during these times. So there's a COVID-19 racism incident report form. So a lot of racism goes unreported. This is one initiative where we're trying to actually daylight some of those issues. There's the C19 Response Coalition, which is actually actively trying to translate all that advice, medical information into different languages, which the government typically doesn't do a lot of. Arts organizations are also taking a bunch of awareness campaigns. So the Vancouver Asian Film Festival has an awareness campaign. And there's also talks about recovery and what recovery looks like, and how a just recovery can happen in Vancouver, but also in the world. We don't necessarily want to go back to status quo, because again, back to the beginning of the presentation, like all these issues existed before, and how do we actually recover in a way that solves, or at least, you know, doesn't put us back into a situation where we're just hiding these things again. That's a lot. There's just too much.
Brandon, those resources are super helpful. Thank you so much for compiling those for us. And it's really great to know that there's different things available for us to support us during these times, whether it be, you know, responding to hate, or, you know, connecting with other people. So we have a couple minutes for questions. I'm going to get the ball rolling for us a little bit. During your talk just now, Brandon, you showed us some pretty powerful, some pretty poignant pieces of art that were created by people around the world that addresses and tackles this issue of the unearthing of the racism that has always existed in our society. But it's really, for me, very impactful to be able to see art so simply put into context of what is happening right now. And obviously, you are involved with many artistic organizations that talk about intersectionality. So I wanted to ask you, what do you see the role of art, artists, and especially keeping in mind our audience right now for youth that, you know, are creating art and maybe thinking about how can I contribute during this time? What do you see the role of art and artists right now? 2 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that art in this time is kind of what we're all turning to in many ways. I think that, you know, when we're all self-isolating, if we have a space to self-isolate in, a lot of us are turning to, you know, comfort in art and things like Netflix or films or music. We're watching people perform live from around the world through Zoom. Like, my brother is a prominent Vancouver drag queen whose drag name is Made in China. And they've been performing a couple times so far during self-isolation times, because you know, we don't have spaces to perform anymore. And so I think that I think people are realizing the importance of art in society, and I think turning to art that reflects a little bit of our reality is really important too. So for instance, one piece of art that I really cling to as a queer person of color is Pose. Highly recommend it. You know, a lot of queer art tends to focus on trauma, and that exists in our world. But I think there's also a lot of room for joy and seeing us in our full power. So I think looking to those pieces to kind of like uplift you, but not hide necessarily from some of the uncomfortable parts as well.
Definitely echo that. Thank you so much, Brandon, for joining us.
Thank you.